Good afternoon or early evening to everybody, and welcome to the Institute of Historical Research seminar, which of course is not in the Institute of Historical Research. I'm sure everyone is scattered in different parts of the globe, mostly in the UK, but maybe not always. And I'm very happy to welcome you to this paper. A couple of people still joining. Yeah, a few people are still joining. Probably most of you know the way we run it, but in case not, you put the questions that you want to put in via the chat at the end. You can either just put in your name and I will ask you to speak, or if you've got trouble with internet connections or whatever and want to put in the whole question, then I will read that out and pass it on to Nick at the end. You won't be able to use the chat until the very end, but that will be enabled when we get to the questions. We normally will run questions for about half an hour or so, not longer, because that's pretty exhausting for the speaker operating online. And I think that's all the housekeeping stuff that I need to do. So my other task, of course, is to introduce the speaker. It's been our great pleasure to have Nick with us at King's over the last year or so, a year and a half. He and I were working very closely together last year. I've been on leave this year, so I have seen less of him, unfortunately, but we can rectify that. Nick is a sort of Byzantinist, also a Near East and Caucasus specialist, does the whole range of things. He is a properly global historian in this era of global history. His doctoral thesis, which is rapidly being turned into a monograph, is on what it's called Mountain, Steppe and Empire, about highlanders in the Caucasus. But this talk today is reflecting his new interests, looking at the sort of economic anthropology of the Byzantine world, and I think all its neighbors as well. And as you've seen, it has this almost Victorian moralistic title, I think, about insatiable greed, which I trust we'll all take to heart and learn from. But for the moment, let me pass over to Nick. As I said, the chat will be enabled at the end. And if you come in with questions via the chat, then I'll make sure they will get answered. So Nick, over to you.
Many thanks indeed for that introduction, Peter, and to all of the conveners and Alice for the invitation to speak to you all. It's very nice to see so many of you. Very kind of you all to come. I'm going to share my screen. Double check that you can all see. I'll ask Peter to nod or something if that looks like what it should look like, and I'll start. So
I haven't got it yet, Nick, actually.
You have not got it yet, okay.
No, it worked perfectly before.
Worked before?
Yes.
Have another go.
It is very exciting. There we go. That looks better.
Okay, good, great. Well, okay, so on a second attempt, I will start. In his 2013 book, Ethnography After Antiquity, Foreign Lands and Peoples in Byzantine Literature, Anthony Kaldelis addressed the surprising absence of the ancient ethnographic tradition in Middle Byzantine literature. Let's see if this works. And I quote, "The Byzantines of the Middle Period had the knowledge and the means to continue the ancient ethnographic tradition and tell us much about the Arabs, Slavs, Bulgarians, Pechenegs, and others that they knew so well. And yet they did not do so," he argued. Kaldelis argued that the tradition of ethnography, the attempt to give a holistic description of another culture, which had been an auxiliary genre, usually embedded within historiographic texts, came to what he described as a crashing end in the 7th century. In his account, the literary tradition of antique ethnography was still represented by the objective descriptions of peoples found in late antique historians such as Procopius, Agathias, and Theophractus, and in the first-person accounts of foreign peoples preserved in Priscus and Menander the Guardsman, but thereafter it largely dried up. Caudelis gives 2 reasons for this caesura, or relative decline, as he puts it elsewhere. After all, as he points out, he did consider there was enough Byzantine ethnography to fill a monograph. Firstly, the radical contraction of the empire in the 7th century, and secondly, Christianity. Not only did, in his view, Christianity do little or nothing to counter the Roman barbarian against barbarians, but, and I quote again, practices and beliefs that the Greek tradition represented ethnographically would come rather under the purview of theology in Byzantium and accordingly be treated polemically. Not until the Paleologan era, from the 13th century, was there a return of what Caudelis characterizes as a late antique, Platonic and pluralist way of representing cultures, each of which was understood to have its own lawgivers and norms, both cultural and religious. Now, Caudelis' account of the role played by Christianity here fits with his own controversial reading of Procopius and Agathias as non-Christian writers. Here, as he himself has pointed out, he finds himself in agreement with Ed of Gibbon and, of course, in radical disagreement with other scholars such as Avril Cameron. My aim today is not to retread that ground. What I want to discuss is a narrower topic than post-antique ethnography in general. I want to look at specifically examples of Middle Byzantine writing about other cultures that deal with those societies' attitudes to wealth and patterns of exchange. In the first part of the paper, I take as my starting point the persistent Byzantine association of an insatiable greed for riches with steppe peoples. Although scholars have had no trouble in recognizing this as a topos, I would argue that essentially the same idea is present in models of nomadic societies that are often applied to interpretations of Byzantine steppe interactions. Not only is this misleading, it also misses an opportunity to probe Byzantine writings about the character of exchanges and material transfers between the empire and steppe to reveal wider Byzantine assumptions about the functions and meanings of movable wealth. In other words, I will discuss the idea of nomadic insatiable greed within the context of both modern and Byzantine economic anthropology. In the second part of the paper, I discuss an idea that does disappear from Byzantine ethnography of exchange after the 6th century, namely the notion of the so-called silent trade. I compare its disappearance in the Byzantine case with its different manifestations in Arabic and East Slavonic writing of the 10th to 12th centuries as an alternative way to think about the shape of the corpus of Byzantine economic anthropology after Antiquity. So, first part. On one level, the fact that the Byzantine sources often refer to the insatiable greed of the nomads does not need belaboring. It appears particularly prominently in the military manuals, which Caudelis describes as the genre of Byzantine ethnography that has received most attention. We meet it, for example, in the Strategikon, attributed to Morris in the chapter on how to deal with the Scythians, specified as the Avars and Turks and other people similar in the Hunnish way of life. They are very suspicious, treacherous, foul, faithless, possessed of an insatiable desire for riches. They scorn their oath, do not observe agreements, and are not satisfied by gifts. Even before they accept the gift, they're making plans for treachery. These characteristics are directly linked in the Strategikon to their way of life and their endurance of severe want, since they are nomads. We already see here a number of the recurring features of the discourse. There is a simultaneous emphasis on the austerity of the conditions in which they live and the limitless desire for wealth that those conditions engender. At the same time, there is a simultaneous emphasis on the fierceness of the monarchical form of government by which they're ruled and the absence of any bonds between rulers and ruled other than those of fear. Around the turn of the 10th century, Leo VI draws directly on this in his Tactica, referring to the Turkey, but here meaning the Mudjas. The 18th constitution of the Tactica draws a direct causal link between the nomads' insatiable desire for riches, again, and their scorning of oaths, where the link is paratactic in the Strategikon. A further example can be found in the 10th century text, familiar 10th century text known as the De Administrando Imperio of Constantine Porphyrogenitos. In the 13th chapter, he warns his son that all the tribes of the north have, as it were, implanted in them a ravening greed of money, never satiated, The tribes of the north here are specified as the Khazars, the Turki, again the Mudjars, the Rus, and other Scythian nations. And once again, the insatiable greed for riches of the nomads and other northern peoples is naturalized. This naturalization of difference between the northerners and the Byzantines is reinforced in a passage at the end of the chapter that generalizes from an argument against kinship alliances with steppe peoples. For each nation has different customs and divergent laws and institutions, and should consolidate those things that are proper to it, and should form and develop out of the same nation the associations for the fusion of its life, just as each animal mates with its own tribe. The naturalization is doing two different jobs here. On the one hand, it presents the insatiable grade for riches of the northerners as an intrinsic quality. This provides the basis for warnings to those Byzantines who have to deal with them to exercise appropriate caution, and provides a justification in advance for Byzantines to refuse demands or renege on earlier commitments. At the same time, the logic of Constantine's argument here is that the northerners do have customs, laws, and institutions of their own that go beyond practices shaped by mere force and necessity. And it's this dual position that I'm going to probe in a minute, looking in particular at Michael Attaliati's approaches to Pechenegs in the 11th century. But first, I want to talk a little bit more about this in topos of the insatiable greed and how it appears in modern scholarship. Modern scholars have had no difficulty identifying the insatiable greed topos, but that has not always precluded them from adopting modes of analysis of medieval steppe societies that mirror some of the ideas found in these Byzantine sources, even while removing the moral judgments and claims to cultural superiority. To take a recent example, Mishamaya's magisterial A New History of the Migration Era begins with a careful analysis of shifting conceptions of the barbarian in the Western and Eastern Roman empires. His introduction includes a lengthy discussion of Ammianus Marcellinus' famous excursus on the Huns, in which Maya echoes Walter Pohl's conclusion that what we're dealing with is an artful montage of motifs from the corpus of ancient ethnography. Maya's systematic presentation of the connections and divergences between how Christianity shaped the changing Roman mental maps of Barbaricum and West and East, alongside his analysis of how Roman interactions with neighboring societies through war, trade, and diplomacy reshaped both the Roman state and its neighbors, is hugely stimulating. And yet, when he comes to describing the dependence of Hunnic society on the attraction of prestige goods from their neighbors, he simply comments, ancient literature reflects the state of affairs with the topos of the allegedly insatiable greed for the gold of Huns. Allegedly, but a few lines later continues, nomadic steppe empires were, on account of their parasitic structures, generally short-lived. He draws here on a familiar model of such societies. The model posits a conical structure in which groupings larger than the individual camping group, although not essential to the pastoral economy, could come together for the purpose of security or in order to extract wealth from sedentary societies. Large and powerful states could form in this way and could incorporate non-nomadic groups with their own political structures in the process. However, according to this model, such states were characterized by an underlying structural dilemma resulting from the ease with which the constituent political groupings could break away. The imperial elites had to maintain a constant war economy, providing sufficient demand for security and opportunity for the wealth extraction from neighboring societies. Alternatively, they could attempt to create new infrastructures to maintain their power by alternative means, but would then risk undermining their particular military capacities based on the flexible deployment of highly mobile mounted warriors. The model has many strengths. It does not necessarily depend on evolutionist assumptions. It certainly does not treat nomadic empires as existing on an earlier or lower developmental stage than settled agrarian empires. On the contrary, it takes as its premise the prior existence of society with settled agriculture as a precondition for the existence of this kind of specialized and militarized pastoral nomadism. It treats larger political units as products of political contingency and decision-making rather than simply reflections of pre-existing ethnic identities. And it also appears to capture the contradiction found in both self-representation and external representations of such societies, such as those we've just seen, when emphasis on the autonomy enjoyed by steppe nomads sits uneasily with the highly autocratic powers vested in the supreme rulers of nomadic empires. However, the model also has its critics. The anthropologist David Sneath argues that it obscures the extent and durability of stratification on the Eurasian steppe over the past few thousand years. Sneath argues that both Western and Soviet anthropologists, for their own reasons, systematically ignored the evidence for an infrastructure of aristocratic power that provided the base for the large centralized states of the Eurasian steppe, but that also endured in their absence. And Sneath argues that an infrastructure of aristocratic power was an indigenous and durable phenomenon on the Eurasian steppe that cannot be reduced to mere imitation of or response to interactions with sedentary states. He points to the extreme longevity of certain aristocratic houses, most notably the Chinggisids, who maintained their economic and political power in Mongolia from the 13th down, in certain cases, to the 20th century. And on your slide, you can see the Chingisid Minister of the Interior in Ulaanbaatar in the 1920s. An earlier example, he suggests, was among the pre-Chingisid Turks was the Ashina line, which had ruled over the West and East Turk Khaganates and from which the rulers of Khazaria claimed descent. Members of such aristocratic houses emphasized their fundamental social distance from their non-aristocratic subjects and held both political and economic power over the latter. These powers could be centralized in the imperial state, or, and this is the key argument of Sneath's book, they could be exercised in a much more decentralized fashion, but they did not simply evaporate in the absence of larger political units. Sneath is deliberately polemical in the form in which he makes his argument, and sometimes seems to deny any possibility of the existence of egalitarian counter traditions on the steppe before the modern era of colonialism and populist nationalism. The work of scholars such as Nicola di Cosmo and Walter Pohl has shown the problems with attempts to impose a single model upon the range of medieval Eurasian steppe societies, and a simple replacement of the tribal model with Sneath's aristocratic law will not help. Equally, the context for specific representations of steppe societies need to be taken into account. In different times and for different purposes, both indigenous witnesses and outsiders have had their own reasons for emphasizing either the underlying egalitarianism or underlying stratification of their societies. Colonial administrators could attempt to incorporate and reinforce as well as destabilize indigenous hierarchies, as Sneath acknowledges, and in doing so, they stood in an ancient tradition. But what I want to suggest is that different theories of nomadic approaches to material wealth could serve these different ends. And in this context, the Pechenegs and the depictions in medieval Byzantine ethnography, I suggest, are interesting. We first meet the Pechenegs in Byzantine sources in the steppes north of the Black Sea, living under Khazar hegemony as a potentially destabilizing force within the Khazar Khaganate in the 10th century. Now, while chapter 13 of the De Administranda Imperio treats the different northern peoples together, the text as a whole is concerned with making distinctions between peoples outside the empire for specific strategic ends. The first chapter of De Administranda reveals the presence of Pecheneg hostages in Constantinople, brought there under imperial supervision to be treated with full imperial hospitality. A likely source of the detailed information on Pecheneg's social structure that follows is thereby indicated. The Pechenegs, we are told, pose a potential threat to Kherson and the Klimata if they're not treated carefully. At the same time, the following chapters explain how the Pechenegs can be used against the Rus, Magyars, Turki, and Bulgarians. In chapter 4, we read that documents, gramata, and gifts dispensed to the Pechenegs can serve as useful down payments to prevent the extraction of even more extortionate money and goods as the cost of peace by the Rus and the Magyars. Insatiable greed is a feature of all northern peoples in this version, but it can be played off between different peoples. Meanwhile, the reference to gramata indicates the value which the Byzantine writing and documentary culture is believed to have held among the Pechenegs in the source. Chapter 6, meanwhile, indicates the existence of personal contacts between Pechenegs and Chersonites. The grouping, Laos, of Pechenegs by Kherson trade with the Chersonites. The final chapter of De Administranda specifies the hides and wax that the Chersonites obtain from this trade and highlights the Chersonites' dependence on access to markets across the Black Sea to sell these products on. Services for the emperor performed by these Pechenegs are procured by the same means that the Chersonites procure services and goods from them, through calibrated payments in, quote, purple cloth, ribbons, loosely woven cloths, gold brocade, pepper, scarlet, or Parthian leather and other commodities, made through agreements between individual Chersonites and Pechenegs. Now, Angeliki Leo referred to this passage in her chapter on economic and non-economic exchange in the economic history of Byzantium. She suggests we are seeing here the first stage of a process by which, to quote, limited transactions such as those involved in barter can develop into monetized market dealings, although she also notes in a footnote that the reverse can, of course, happen. But another way of viewing these exchanges would be as involving commodity currencies with their own functions and patterns of circulations within the Khazar Khaganate. And I've been exploring the latter possibility in my other research as a way of interpreting finds of just such types of materials, of cloth, ribbons, bits of ribbons, bits of brocade, bits of leather and other commodities in burial sites in the North Caucasus. As the specialist on the Mongols, Thomas Olsen, has argued, nomadic political systems do not simply create a pax that facilitates trade between different regions under the hegemony. I quote, the process of state formation among the nomads in and of itself stimulates trade through an increased demand for precious metals, gems, and most importantly, fine cloths. Also important for our present purposes is the presentation of these exchanges as operating between individual Kassanites and Pechenegs. The sentence that immediately follows from that point describes the Pechenegs as free, eleftheri, and autonomi, and it recalls characteristics attributed by Leo VI to the Mudgers. But the context here alters the implications of the freedom and autonomy attributed to the Pechenegs, whereas in the Tactica, the freedom of the Mudgers is invoked to explain the weaknesses of agreements made with their leaders. Here, the autonomy of the Pechenegs opens up the prospect of individual contracts. Pechenegs are no less insatiable, the same word, arplisti is used for all that. While individual Pechenegs may form contracts with the Kassanites, in their dealings with imperial agents, they also demand gifts for their wives and kin, and the escorts demand payment for the labor and wear and tear of their cattle. So we've already noted a tension between two Byzantine images of the northern peoples as governed by necessity and insatiable greed on the one hand, and acknowledging that they had customs, laws, and institutions of their own that go beyond practices shaped by mere force and necessity on the other. Chapter 37 of the Demonstrand gives an account of Pecheneg tribal structure, and it appears to draw on a Pecheneg informant describing principles of collateral succession and administrative division, with 8 themata themselves divided into 40 districts. Some clans hold higher status than others, but there is no overall ruler. And fortunately, it includes the line law, nomos, and ancient principle, tupos, have prevailed among them. We're some way at this point from the image that we saw in the Tactica of the nomads as simultaneously subject to tyrannical power and lawless. Now, I now turn to 2 representations of the insatiability of the Pechenegs in the Balkans in the mid-11th century. First, in the Synopsis Historion of John Scarlet, sees in passages that Jonathan Shepherd has argued originate from the history of Cataclysm and Kakavmanos, and second in the history of Michael Ataliates. The passage from Scarlet, Caesar, Cataclysm, and Kakavmanos, describes the events of the years 1046 to 1047. It begins by placing the Pechenegs within the hereditary category of the royal Scyths. We are told that they are divided into 13 tribes, as opposed to the 8th themata and 40 districts of the Demonstrando. Scarletti's source also describes them grazing their flocks on the plains which extend beyond the Danube from the river Dnieper, for they are nomads who always prefer to live in tents, he says. But the narrator then moves from this general characterization of Pecheneg ethnography to an account of a case of Pecheneg attempted upward social mobility and its impact on a series of migrations into Byzantine territory. At that time, he says, the leader of the people was Tirak, son of Bilta, highly distinguished by birth, but otherwise unremarkable, a man who preferred to live in peace. But there was another person in that people whose name was Keganets, the son of Baltasar, a nobody by birth and practically nameless, but extremely effective in battle and in the waging of war. This was an unsettled period in the politics of the steppes, as Oghuz and Kipchak nomads began challenging the Pechenegs for control of pasture in the Balkans. Ronnie Ellenblum has linked these movements with climate changes, but as our Byzantine observer recognized, what was crucial was political organization decisions of the nomads themselves. Kegan's prestige was growing among the Pechenegs for his preparedness to lead offensives against the Oghuz, while Tirak preferred to retreat to the marshes and lakes along the Danube. This led to an eventual confrontation between the two Pechenegs, in which the numerical superiority of Tirak led to the latter Kegan to return to the Byzantines. The narrative continues that Kagan first made contact with the governor of the region, Michael, son of Anastasios, and the Byzantine imperial administration then moved fast to take advantage of the situation, immediately facilitating the journey of Kagan and his followers to Constantinople. There we are told the latter was met by the emperor, baptized, given the title of Patrikios, and granted control over 3 Danube fortresses and a significant area of land, presumably for his followers to use as pasture. This they then used as the base from which to launch raids against the Pechenegs still loyal to Tarik north of the Danube, provoking complaints from the latter to the emperor. These were ignored, leading to full-scale military confrontation, in which Tarik's forces were ultimately defeated. Now, Scarlet's source tells us that at this point, Kagan put pressure on the Byzantines to massacre the defeated Pechenegs. He told them a proverb, which, barbarian though it be, has something in it. Once you kill the snake while it is still winter, and it cannot move its tail, for once it is warmed by the sun, it will give us much toil and trouble. But the Byzantines resisted this advice, which they thought was a barbaric and impious act unworthy of Roman benevolence. The source outlines some more hard-headed reasoning at the same time. The settlement of the Pechenegs across the desert plains of Bulgaria also provide a source of tax revenue, and Pechenegs could be called upon as needed to fight against the Turks, now threatening Byzantine territories in eastern Anatolia. So Tarik and his 140 followers were taken to Constantinople, where the emperor had been baptized and awarded the highest honors, entertaining them in luxury, we're told. Now, the narrative structure of this passage allows the Byzantine author to offer alternative materialist approaches to interactions with the nomads. The most cynical of all is put into the mouth of Kagan, the force of whose proper is to deny the possibility that bonds of loyalty between Tarik and the empire could be established through their settlement in imperial territory. The implication of such a view, a call for a policy of extermination, is rejected as immoral. But then pragmatic reasons are also given for settling the Pechenegs. The narrator is well aware of the irony of this passage, given that Tarik and his companions would in fact prove to be less than faithful to their words. They not only took part in a rebellion against the imperial authorities, I quote, looking out for their own interests regardless of the undertakings they given Monarchos, but also broke their sworn pledges to Kagan himself in a plot that led to the latter's death and dismemberment. The proverb that Scarlet sees, or Cataclysm, attributes to Kagan is closely mirrored in Michael Attaliati's discussion of the same war. Attaliatis also recounts how the Scythians or Pechenegs crossed the Danube and describes their loathsome diet and other ways of life. He makes no mention of Kagan or Tarik by name and shows no awareness of the internal tensions within Pecheneg society. But he does describe the baptism of their leaders, the gifts and the decision to allow them to return to their clans. However, Attaliatis continues, the Emperor Constantine IX realized then that it is utterly pointless to try to paint the Ethiopian white, and that to benefit a bad man is like feeding a snake. Or rather, he didn't realize, because in his account of the years that follow, Attaliatis again criticizes Constantine's further futile attempts, quote, to win their favor and soften their barbaric and insolent character by bestowing Roman gifts and titles on them. Now, Dimitris Kralis has commented on the apparent contradiction between Attaliatis' insistence on the futility of attempts to appease the Pechenegs in the 1040s and his later presentation of his own role in binding the Pechenegs to Romanus IV in 1071. Wanting to lift the suspicion that hovered over the Scythians, I myself advised the emperor to bind them with an oath. He accepted my advice, therefore I had them swear oaths in their traditional manner. Now, Crowley suggests that in Attaliatis' view, the mistake in the earlier case was to attempt to impose on them a Roman cultural register. Instead, the key was to use their own customary practices, which they did respect. Perhaps, but what we're also seeing is a reflection of that wider pattern in Byzantine texts, where the impossibility of establishing relationships of trust with the nomads is asserted at one moment, and various methods of establishing dealings, including economic dealings with them, are presented at another. At this point, I want to draw us back to the question of Byzantine conceptualizations of economic dealings with the nomads in general, and implications for Byzantine assumptions about the functions and meanings of movable wealth. We've seen that the aplistia, the insatiable greed of the nomads was often linked in Byzantine conception with a model of nomad economy that was entirely dependent on transfers of material wealth from the Byzantine world. This insatiable greed meant that relations with the steppe society were based on need and force alone, and so necessarily were relations between Byzantine and steppe society. At the same time, the very same texts often did entertain the possibility of material exchanges with the steppe world, and relations of trust that underpin them. These relationships of trust were established through both nomadic engagement in Byzantine cultural forms and Byzantine engagement in nomadic cultural forms. These relationships of trust were established through direct personal contacts by agents of the imperial center, or by those such as the 10th century Chersonites, who might also be suspected of acting independently of the latter. Michael Attaliates invokes the insatiable greed model when discussing earlier affairs in the Balkans, with which he was not directly involved. But in his discussion of his own direct contact with the Pechenegs in the campaign in 1071, he asserts his ability to recognize and use Pecheneg cultural forms to establish relations of trust. The personal contacts underlying Cataclysm Kakavmanos's information in the Pechenegs, as reflected in those passages from Scarlet, are poignantly and directly referred to in the same text. Kakavmanos himself had been left for dead in a Pecheneg raid when a Pecheneg, Koulinos by name, who knew who Kakavmanos was because he came from the fortress on the Danube where the peoples mingle with each other, spotted him and carried him back to his tent where he nursed him back to life. These reflections on the moral grounds of interactions between steppe people and Byzantines were also reflections on value. Was value formed by scarcity alone? When the insatiable greed of the nomads was invoked, that was the implication. From this perspective, the austere conditions that Byzantine writers associated with life in the steppe determined nomad demand for material wealth to be extracted from the empire and determined the weak social ties within nomadic society as well. The idea that the unrestrained pursuit of profit could also dissolve social ties within Byzantine society simultaneously exercise some of the same writers, such as Michael Attaliates. For instance, due in his view to the malign influence of the minister Nikephoritsis at the court of Michael VII, he claimed every deliberation was about profit, regardless of whether churches were being desecrated or human beings harmed, and those who deviously offered the best excuses to justify this unjust and God-hated profit stood above everyone else at court. In a striking inversion, he holds the barbarians up as a mirror to this profit-obsessed cabal at court. It is said that justice is honoured among the barbarian nations, that their traditions are maintained uncorrupted by them. But while Attaliates was fierce in his criticism of Nikephoritsis' profit-seeking, he also gives us, as Paul Magdaleno discussed many years ago, a valuable account of market mechanisms in price formation, for instance, in his account of the grain trade at Rodestos on the north coast of the Marmara Sea. There, Attaliates decried Nikephoritsis' establishment of this institution called the Fundax, which imposed a monopoly and distorted the market so that those who brought their grain to sell market of Rodestos were no longer able to derive profits they formerly enjoyed. Angeliki Leo argued that in the later 11th century, the idea of free negotiation, that prices could and should be set in the marketplace according to supply and demand, was gaining ground in Byzantium, and cited examples from both Michael Attaliates and Michael Psilos of this type of thinking. At the same time, she insisted that, I quote, both non-economic and economic exchange existed at all times in Byzantium, as they do in all societies, including our own, and that the historian's task, quote, should be to identify the phenomena that belong to either sphere and to examine their relative weight to the extent possible. The suggestion I would end this section of the paper by making is that the apparent contradictions between Byzantine notions of the insatiable greed of the nomads and accounts of mechanisms through which goods and services could be exchanged between nomads and Byzantines were, among other things, reflections upon the boundaries between those spheres. Now, in the second part of this paper, I turn to the idea in economic anthropology known as the silent trade, but which I think might be better characterized as socially distanced trade. The classic account, as so often, is in Herodotus. His report is secondhand from the Carthaginians, and it describes a case of long-distance trade beyond the Pillars of Hercules. On reaching this country, they unload their goods, arrange them tidily along the beach, and then, returning to their boats, raise a smoke. Seeing the smoke, the local inhabitants come down to the beach, place on the ground a certain quantity of gold in exchange for the goods, and go off again to a distance. The Carthaginians then come ashore and take a look at the gold, and if they think it represents a fair price for their goods, they collect it and go away. If, on the other hand, it seems too little, they go back aboard and wait, and the local inhabitants come and add to the gold until they are satisfied. Neither side cheats. The Carthaginians never touch the gold until it equals the goods in value, and the local inhabitants never touch the goods until the gold has been taken away. Now, this version, the original version, could perhaps be described as an example of silent trade. There is no sound described. Participants do not seem to see each other. The signal is given by smoke. However, the key point is not about the noise, but about the possibility of exchange in the context of absolute social separation. In Herodotus's case, it is of paramount importance that there should be no social contact between the Carthaginian traders and their West African trading partners, and that there should be no treaty. So, socially distanced trade, I'd suggest. Now, Pliny the Elder gives us another example. According to him, Roman and other merchants in the Indian Ocean reported exchanges between the Seris, Chinese, and the inhabitants of Taprobani, Sri Lanka, in which they used no language in their commercial dealings, linguae, or maybe this simply means they simply had no common language. Merchants place their wares on the opposite side of a river by goods deposited by their local inhabitants, and if the latter are satisfied, again, they take them away. This brings us to our Byzantine, brings us to the author of the 6th century Christian topography, usually identified as the Alexandrian merchant Cosmas Indicopleustes, who describes another such interaction in East Africa. So I'm going to briefly talk about this. So the kings of Axum, Ethiopia, used an intermediary to trade with the inhabitants living in the valley of the Blue Nile and further south. The traders deposited joints of beef, blocks of silt, and iron on a fence assembled out of acanthus plants. The local inhabitants then place gold ingots on the part of the meat that they want, or the salt or iron, and retreat. And once again, the traders only take away the gold once they are satisfied. Cosmas adds, such is the commerce of those there, since they speak different languages, and above all, because they lack interpreters. Now, this picks up a theme implied by Pliny the Elder's Nulla Commercio Linguae, but it is not really relevant to Herodotus' account, or logically to Cosmas's own account of socially distanced trade. The absence of shared language does not explain the efforts made to maintain social distance. Two different ideas are being awkwardly combined here. One about how speakers of different language groups overcome difficulties of communication, the other about how material goods can be acquired without social contact. Now, once again, in the Economic History of Byzantium, Angeliki Lau refers to this passage in Cosmas Indicopleustes as the sole Byzantine source to invoke the idea of the silent trade, although she seemed to regard it as likely that it was more widely practiced. Now, Anthony Cardelis does not discuss the passage in question, but he does discuss the Christian topography, which he regards as what he calls a non-starter in the development of Byzantine ethnography. I quote, "Its conspicuous display of knowledge about exotic places positions it within the agonistic context of the otherwise secular ethnographic scene of the 6th and 7th centuries, i.e. Procopius and Agathias. This allows Cardelis to maintain his argument that the antique ethnographic tradition was essentially secular, and the Christian topography, by virtue of its very oddness, is the exception that perhaps proves the rule. However, if notions of socially distanced trade disappeared from Byzantine ethnography, they persisted in the Arabic geographic tradition. In the 10th century, Al-Masudi describes the completion of an exchange by people living beyond Sijil Massa in Morocco. Again, foreign merchants deposit their wares by a river and return the next day to find gold beside it. If satisfied, they take the gold. Otherwise, they wait for a higher price. The similarities between these accounts suggest that whatever new information the various writers were gathering, they were also aware of a stock of literary anecdotes that have been circulating in the Mediterranean since at least the time of Herodotus. Three particular features that all of these stories have in common are that they describe the outer limits of the writer's known worlds. They invoke situations in which at least one set of participants want as little to do with the other as possible. And the stories are all given on the authority of one or more intermediaries. We've also seen that early on in this sequence, an ambiguity crept in about the purpose of this silent or socially distant trade. Is it to bypass a communication barrier, or is it to avoid the need for social communication altogether? What I want to talk about is an example that appears in the Risk Chronicles. Al-Masudi's account of the silver trade in West Africa appears directly after a reference to the Wall of Gog and Magog. And as is well known, medieval Christian and Muslim writers often turned to a shared set of apocalyptic traditions about the enclosed nations whom Alexander the Great had locked behind a wall when describing peoples from or beyond the limits of their cultural or geographical horizons. In the Rus primary chronicle, the Bovis Vermikliet, we see a similar connection being made with these traditions accessed by a Slavonic translation of the 7th century Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius. The story appears in the Bovis entry for the year 1096. The entry includes an eyewitness account of a traumatic assault by the Pelopsians, a nomadic people led by Bonyak, on Kiev and the monastery of the Caves, in which several of the chronicler's fellow monks were killed. The chronicler then identifies the Pelopsian, along with other nomadic groups such as the Pechenegs and Cumans, with the Ishmaelite tribes described in the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius as hailing from the desert of Yathrib. The story about socially distanced trade in the north is introduced after the account of the attack on the monastery of the Caves. It is told to the chronicler by a Novgorodian named Gyuriata Rogovich, who had sent an agent to the north to collect tribute. Gyuriata describes how his agent had traveled to the northern people of the Pechora to collect tribute. The latter had then traveled on to the Yugra, further north in the far north, or what is now Russia, who speak an intelligible language. The Yugra had nevertheless managed to tell the agent about a new wonder, Chudanova, in the even further north, about which they had not previously heard. It began 3 years ago, the Yugra say, and the apocalyptic significance of this is of fundamental importance to the chronicler, and it is this that he seeks to interpret for Gyuriata and for his readers. However, there's also an interpretive challenge posed by the story Gyuriata told the chronicler. First, Gyuriata tells us that the Yugra speak an unintelligible language, and then gives an extended account of what the Yugra had told his agent about people with whom they had to communicate by means of gestures alone, since they cannot be understood. What are we supposed to believe? That the agent does understand the language of the Yugra, even though they speak an unintelligible language, or has his own, unnamed, unmentioned interpreters? The logical inconsistency that we notice in Cosmas about the relationship between social distance, trade, and language is hovering around this text as well. What follows does not seem to show direct textual dependence on the Herodotean model for the silent trade. First of all, it's all very noisy. More importantly, the impediment to communication is imposed by Alexander of Macedon in the chronicler's reading rather than chosen. However, the linkage to trade is an element that is missing from the apocalyptic prototype about the enclosed nations. Meanwhile, the cosmological significance of the fur trade in the far north was something that clearly exercised this chronicler, as we can see from the associated passage in the year 6622, 1114, with another second or third hand account. In this case, it is an explanation of the glass beads found along the river Volkhov that is offered. These are easily explained as trade beads, as Likhachov noticed in his commentary to this passage, and it is in fact the implicit explanation studiously avoided by the inhabitants of Ladoga, who tell of old men who had gone beyond the Yugra, i.e. this far north again, and the Samoyed, and had seen squirrels and deer fall from the sky. The fur of northern lands is here presented as something that has arrived as a divine bounty, obtained without the mediation of any contact with the human inhabitants of the far north, a point on which the chronicler can then elaborate with material drawn from the 6th century Byzantine chronicler John Malalas via the compilation known as the chronograph. The Arab writer Abu Hamid al-Ghanati, by contrast, was evidently well aware of the Herodotean silent trade model. Abu Hamid from Granada travelled across the Muslim world with time spent in Ifriqiya, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Persia, as well as venturing north to the mouth of the Volga in the 1130s and making a subsequent trip across Eastern Europe in the 1150s. Now, in his description of the trade of the Bulgar on the Volga, he mentions the beaver fur available there, makes a social distinction between the different types of beaver fur available, that of beaver elites and of their slaves. On one level, this does not inspire confidence in the reliability of his information, but it does create an unsettling and perhaps revealing linkage between the extractive fur and slave trades. By the way, I recently noticed a similar notice appears in Gerald of Wales, and I need to do my homework on the ultimate origin of this idea about beaver hierarchies. I don't know whether somebody here could help me with that. Anyway, Al-Ghanati's description of the trade with the Europe beyond the Wisu exactly corresponds to the Herodotean model of silent trade. This is in turn followed, though, by details of what the traders brought the people in the north, rather than the other way around, as in the Herodotean model. As in the the Rus chronicle account, the northerners are supplied with metal blades, in this case from centers of the Muslim world, Zanjan, Abha, Tabriz, and Isfahan. And in this case, they come adapted to northerners' needs in the form of swords or harpoons. The Yura al-Qarnati tells us we're not a warlike people, and he mentions a huge profit merchants gained from exchanging swords for sable and skins with them. He then describes their fishing as itself a strange form of exchange with the sea, obtaining fish by throwing swords into the river. The accounts of the people in the far north, in the Porvis Chronicle and in Al-Gharnati, also resonate with Ibn Fadlan's much earlier account of his trip to the Volga, Bulgaria, written 200 years before Al-Gharnati was writing. The passage in question is a story told to Ibn Fadlan by the king of the Volga Bulgars about a giant in the far north. The giant had apparently been found by merchants, and the king had him brought to his residence. Again, communication was impossible. The king reports he just looked at us when the king and his men tried to talk to him. So the king wrote, or kataba, to the Wisu, how this communication worked, we're not told, who replied, identifying him as one of Gog and Magog. Now, there's no reference in this case to silent or socially distanced trade, but beyond the obvious parallel to Gog and Magog material that we found in the Province Firmiclet account, and here the link to Gog and Magog is supplied directly by the Wisu rather than added as a learned gloss, as in the Province Firmiclet account. There is a further parallel with the story about the miraculous supply of fish. And here, it's God providing the enclosed nation each day with an enormous fish, which they come and cut with their knives and eat until they develop stomach aches. While there is no reference to silent trades, the themes of incommunicability, enforced isolation, and the unsettling and time-limited bounty of the lands of darkness are all there already in Ibn Fadlan. Time-limited because, the Wisu warn, quote, when Almighty God intends them to swarm forth into the inhabited lands, he will cause the wall to be breached, the sea will dry up, and the fish will no longer be provided. I'm going to try to draw some strands together. What the socially distanced trade idea, which did disappear from Byzantine economic anthropology after Antiquity, has in common with the insatiable greed of the nomads idea, which persisted, is a concern with the material transfers across apparently fundamental cultural and often ecological divides. In his Stone Age economics, Marshall Salins described the spectrum between generalized reciprocity, where redistribution happens within a community without necessary expectation of direct return, what he called the sociable extreme, balanced reciprocity, where exact equivalence between goods exchanged is established, what he calls the midpoint, and negative reciprocity, where one side is trying to get the better of the other, the unsociable extreme. The topos of the insatiable greed of the nomads would at first sight clearly appear to evoke negative reciprocity. Today, I have suggested that it's worth thinking about the manifestations of this topos in Middle Byzantine writing further. Its apparent resonances with contemporary models of nomadic prestige good economies may obscure our understanding of both the nomadic societies themselves and some subtler tensions that can be found in Byzantine writings on material exchanges of the steppe. In Solins's terms, can patterns of more balanced reciprocity or even generalized reciprocity sometimes hide behind rhetorics of negative reciprocity? Meanwhile, the socially distanced trade narratives we have discussed, both in the antique tradition and then later Arab and Slavonic literature, would seem to evoke situations of apparently balanced reciprocity that teeter on the very edge of negative reciprocity. Now, Caldella suggested that it was the draining of secularity from Byzantium that ended the pluralist way of representing cultures, each of which was understood to have its own lawgivers and norms, both cultural and religious. I am unconvinced that pluralist conceptions of culture disappeared from Middle Byzantine thought in the manner or for the reasons that Caldella suggests. In fact, the risk chronicler we have seen deploying the idea of social distance trade did turn to the 9th century Byzantine chronicler of George the Monk for the notion that each people has its own written law or customs, which those peoples without laws considered to have been handed down by their fathers. Moreover, we've seen that Middle Byzantine thinking about economic interaction with nomads could lead to representations of nomads as having their own cultural and religious norms. We should take these seriously in our interpretation of the role of prestige goods in Byzantine steppe interactions. Moreover, in that sense, I'd argue, at least, there was Byzantine economic anthropology after Antiquity.